Welcome to any new and or regular attendees to Intabor Institute's webinar, Mastering Issue Management in Risky Project. As a brief introduction, my name is Michael Tromper. I'm one of the partners here at Intabor Institute. And I've been in the area of project and risk management and software development for over 20 years. This webinar is going to include both some slides and a live demonstration, and it's being recorded, available for viewing on our website within 48 hours. Before we start, I'd just like to go over some basic housekeeping and how you can participate in the webinar. You should see pane up on the right side of your screen, which will allow you to select your audio and also interact with the webinar. If you haven't done so, I recommend using the computer audio, as the audio quality tends to be a bit better than phone in. Feel free to use the questions pane to ask questions during the webinar. If you have any technical issues with the broadcast, you can ask the questions, in the questions pane, and we'll address those as best we can. Otherwise, all questions will be answered at the end of the webinar in the order they came in. So just quick overview of what we're going to be looking at, risks versus issues. The reason why, actually, I'll just go back and say the reason why this particular topic was selected is I've had a few discussions over the last several months on the issue about whether risks versus issues, how do we manage them, and how do especially about issues, and we'll talk about systemic issues, and maybe how do we handle them as part of our analysis and management. I'm probably going to be asking more questions that I'll be answering here, but I will go through and say how we can sort of set up how RiskyProject handles issues, how you can model them, how they get risks can be converted to issues, and how we can set up what I call an issue register. So that's sort of how we'll go through today. I don't know if it's going to be a particularly long webinar. We'll see. So issues versus risks. Risks are events that have a probability of occurring during a project that will impact project objectives. They are identified, analyzed, mitigated, etc., before to minimize their potential impact. For example, a key supplier could go bankrupt, causing a disruption in the project schedule. One of the key phrase in here is they have a probability. So there's it's between 0 and 100% of occurring. So we don't know. We think it could occur. So we want to be account for that. Issues are events or situations that have already occurred or are currently happening and are causing a negative impact on the project. They need to be addressed or resolved. For example, community support for a project. There might be community, we might call it community opposition. And both are part of the risk life cycle in a risky project. I'd like to differentiate now that there's two types. There's project risks that have occurred. So risks that we've identified and then they occur. So they become an issue. They are now a part of the ongoing project, and they need to be dealt with. So not all of the risks become issues, but some do. And for the purposes of an analysis, if you're running an SRA or a cost analysis or a joint costs and schedule analysis, the impacts are no longer probabilistic. So whatever the impacts were, they're no longer happening probabilistically. They are occurring at 100%. But there's also issues that are not project risk, but are rather systemic and outside of the control of the project team, or have very little control over them. For systemic issues, the question that then becomes how to account for their impacts. Model them as risk with 100% probability, or account for them in the original baseline. And this is one of the questions that I've been going back and forth with a few of the people that I interact with on a regular basis. I'm not sure. One of the things that has come up, and I realized when I first started out in this business, a lot of times what were identified as risks were actually issues. And so that we'd go on and say, I'll have a few more examples, but I had very early on working with a company that had a procurement issue. And in the course, they said we have our procurement is an issue for us. It's not, we're not getting things on time. It's a risk. And so it ended up being modeled as a risk with a fairly high probability. Well, in fact, that was an issue, should have been an issue. And it should have been, then the part is do we want to model that as a risk, but with 100% probability, or do we want to account for that in the original baseline? And that's basically, that is something that needs to be discussed, because we do want to account for that, but how do we do it? So this is an example. So a company has a problem with hiring, obtaining resources. Resourcing has become an issue that affects all projects. So at the project level, they have less impact on how that's going to be able to resolve that issue, because that's going to be held up at a higher level program or at the company level. That's a company level. But so how do you account for it? You add it as I'm going to call it added as an issue in the thing. And so within RiskyProject, you might have it as a global risk that has, and in this example, has 100% impact, a relative delay, and then we have with the relative delay, and then we have a little triangular statistical distribution. Alternatively, as part of the schedule, do you build it into the baseline schedule with increased durations and ranges for 3-point estimates? I don't know. But it is a question, because there's two schools of thought on that. There's actually a third one that takes all of the issues and builds it into, I would call them systemic issues, put them into factors, and develop a parametric model. We'll call it parametric modeling, but it's basically a statistical distribution. And that is used to replace all of the 3-point estimates. So we don't put in the sort of base, low, and high. We just put in one large parametric distribution that's occurring at 100% of the time. So it's like an issue. It's a giant issue that accounts for all of the strategic inputs, community, stakeholder involvement, maturity models, all of those things, and comes up with a statistical distribution. Those are issues. A lot of times when we look at 3-point estimates, we're assuming some of the issues that we might have in the system So those are just some questions. With the risk life cycle in RiskyProject, risk has a 3-stage life cycle. They have risks, events that have a probability between 0 and 1. Issues, events that are situations that have a 100% probability and are currently impacting the project. And lessons learned. And those are really just to be able to flag. They'll have a history behind them and can be used for future assessments. Now, one of the things when we go into the risk life cycle, and up at the top, you can see there's a risk life cycle drop-down list to be able to assign it. If a risk converts to an issue, you can convert it here in this drop-down list, and regardless of what probabilities in the system, it will automatically be set to 100% probability for the purposes of the analysis. So that's if you do come through and doing an assessment, running through, and you do have that risk does get realized, we just set it to an issue in here, and it automatically sets the probability to 100%. Response plans are actions that take place if a risk occurs. That is, if the risk converts to an issue. They can be used qualitatively or quantitatively. Response plans have outcome type. For quantitative analysis, they have outcome type and outcome, and are created in the mitigation and response view. When that used quantitatively, and I'm not sure if this is, we can see that clearly, but what happens is we can go into the system on the risk assignment, and for the outcome type, for the outcomes, we can select the execute response plan. And in the execute response plan, we can then go in and we can select a response plan. So we say, what's the outcome type? It'll be, and this is hopefully showing this down here, we select execute response plan and then executes the response. So we don't actually add in any probability or statistical distributions. It's just a single plan. The benefit of that is that it can be broadcasted. It can, one response plan can then be used for multiple risks. Qualitatively, if you're doing it as a qualitative risk assessment, response plans can be added to a risk in the risk form. At the bottom, the default view is that we have a response plan, and that in there you can add that response plan that you've added up here in the mitigation response view. You can add that, and then for reporting purposes, it will add if that risk is realized, it will add those costs as the cost of recovery from that risk. So that's how mitigation, obviously before, response plan, you might even call it a contingency plan, is something that is accounted for after a risk occurs. So when we go through doing assessment, we're going to begin the assessment. We're going to identify, we're going to assess, and then we want to say, is it a risk or an issue? This is a little sort of flow chart. If it's a risk, then we're going to go through the standard assignment, and we can add assign it standardly, and do a mitigation. And what the response does is basically overwrites the cost and schedule impacts. Now, if it's an issue, one of the question is, are we going to include it in the register? And at that point, if we include it in the register, then we can model it, similar to what we have as a risk. So it's like basically we're doing a converted risk, and we can include it in the baseline. Or alternatively, you're going to include what you think the effects of that were in the baseline. My own gut feeling is I think we can do it. You could do it a little bit more accurately or get a better assessment if we modeled it, as rather than trying to include it across the in the schedule to make sure that we can get that as accurately as possible. Again, that's up to your team and your schedulers and your risk managers. Lastly, and I'll go through this, we can create an issue register. So in RiskyProject, we can add multiple tabs to the risk register. In this case, we can create one for risks, a view for risks, and we can create a view for issues. We do that, we can apply a filter to the view. And in this one, you can see it's a risk and issue and equals issue, and then only issues will be shown. And optionally, we can add issue-specific properties to the risk system, and then add them to the view. So at this point, I'm just going to go quickly over into RiskyProject and show you how we might look at this. Now, if we had a risk, and we'll just run a quick calculation on this. Not a lot of stuff. We can go here, and if we go here, and we'll get this message coming up. So what that means is now, probably did. Let me see if that flipped over on us. It did not. That's odd. Okay. Oh, that's fine because it didn't stick. Okay. I'm not sure if that. Oh, that's why. And let me just, I'm just going to clear this filter out here. And we can see now that this has become an issue. We look in here, that goes to 100%. So that occurs automatically. Now, one of the things that we talked about, and then it can be modeled. So really anything that we have in there in terms of that distribution is happening 100%. So in many ways, it looks like the same sort of uncertainty that you would, uncertain that you might apply to activities where there is no probability, it's just 100%, it's occurring at 100% of the time, and that's become an issue. So here we have our risk register. In the issues, again, what we can do is you can go in, you can create a new tab. And what I did here, what you can do down here is create a new tab. And that creates that automatically, and it's going to use the default view. I'm just going to, and I'll just recreate this one. If you want, we can create a new color. I like to just for differentiation purposes. Up here, as part of that, if we want, we can create additional risk properties. We can create a section for issue management properties that can be added to the view. Now, I'm just going to switch over to the original one. What you can see is because there's no such thing as post-mitigated issues that are occurring, so I got rid of that. I applied the filter to it, which is, you can go to the properties, risk and issues, equals Boolean logic, and just type in issue. And we get that view. And what I did here was I added that property, and that's you can see that once we've added it to the default properties, and then we can add it and any sort of properties that you might want to include. Now there's a few other ways that you can handle it if you don't want to have that. We can also we can separate them out using a default drop-down list here, which categorizes them out. That's another way of doing it. Or we can set this and we can go and we can get a view on there. So these are the ways that we can isolate or report on our issues. There's nothing really special about it in terms of the difference between a full workflow on risk, but we can tailor the system so that once a risk is realized or we have an issue that we're going to model as an issue in the system, we can have a specific view set up where we can look at them and they can be updated and reported on as required. So this has been about a bit of a short webinar today. Again, if you have any questions or would like to discuss this, here's our information. You can send it directly. If you have a question, you can send it directly to me at mtrucker@dataver.com. If you have any questions about this. If not, thank you very much for attending.